Well, new suspension required for the Daytona. Forks, it's going to be dead easy. New springs sprung for my weight. Fresh oil. New seals. They're in that box. Rear shock, again sprung for my weight. And just rebound damping. That's all the original shock has, rebound damping. But wow, it's so much easier to choose suspension for this bike than it would be that. The suspension on that Daytona is real easy for me because it's a fairly single purpose bike. It's going to take my weight. It's never going to take any luggage. Small tailbag maybe with a bit of wet weather gear, but nothing of any consequence. So choosing the suspension for this bike to my exact weight, rider weight, with all my clothes on, is going to be perfect, and I'll get a perfect setup for it. Something you can't do on a bike like this. Okay, it's got electronic suspension, but ignore that for a minute. This bike has got to try and cope with me as a solo rider, with piles of heavy aluminium luggage and tents and shit like that, pillions. So the spring rate on this bike is always going to be a compromise from the manufacturer, or whether I did something with it later on myself. Now, I wouldn't do it on a bike with electronic suspension. But if I was buying this bike again and I was tempted to buy the one with non-electronic suspension, I can totally customize that for my use. Let's say if I was a solo rider with a particular weight going around the world, that's what you probably do. But the fact that this bike has sometimes got to be solo, sometimes got to be loaded up, sometimes with pillion. It's great, I can change the damping, that's great, but I can't change the spring rate. This is why choosing the suspension for this is such an easy job. It has a sole purpose, it's going to carry one weight. That weight is not going to change much at all. So I'll get a spring rate in those shocks there, and I'll get a spring rate for the rear shock, and I'm laughing. It'll be perfectly set up for my weight, this bike. And I needn't spend a lot of money. In the end result, what I'm going to spend on this, suspension-wise, will still be cheap. I mean, that rear shock is cheap. I can buy cheaper, but it's still at the lower end of the scale. So by default, rear wheel travel on this is 126mm. That's vertical travel. And the front forks, that's 150mm. Not forgetting that's at an angle, mind. So, you know, roughly 130mm suspension vertically, front and back. When I sit on this bike, I can change the preload front and rear, which you can. There's a preload adjustment on the front here, but you know, I can easily use up 50% of the travel here. So I have to get pretty full on that preload to stop using up all that suspension travel. So that's part of the problem. The spring rate, front and rear, are too low. I'm just using too much of my suspension stroke up, even with my adjustable preload, even trying to change that to allow for it. So this is going to give me a lot more travel on the bike because I'm not going to be sitting so low on the spring. So I should get back full suspension travel, a lot more comfort on this bike, and I can allow a bit more travel, which I can't now. I have the damping set fairly firm to stop me bottoming out on some of the back country roads. So that new spring rate is going to do wonders for that. It's just going to deliver my suspension travel back to me, and that's the idea. But you know, if I was 70 kilos, I wouldn't bother. I'd get the forks refurbed, you know, new oil, new seals, that type of stuff, a bit of a service. But I'd leave the springs as they are. The original Triumph springs were triple rate springs in the front. And the rear spring I mean, springs can get a bit tired over the years, but you know, not drastically, if they were reasonable quality when they came out. So I'd say the original spring length of that rear shock is pretty much what it was like when it came out of the factory. So I'm only doing this because I'm a heavier rider. If that rear shock was rebuildable, I would just have it serviced and fresh oil and stuff like that. And that's all I'd get done in the front forks. I wouldn't even change the springs. But it's because I'm heavier, new springs front and rear. And the shocks will get serviced while I'm at it. And as I say, that rear shock is non-serviceable. So I've just got to ditch it in favour of my replacement, which is going to be Wilbur's. I looked at a few springs, went through a few for a different price, and the Wilbur seemed like a good compromise. Hopefully this will all be done in the not too distant future. Just waiting for the items to come in. And do you know, that's what's a bit annoying about some YouTubers. Oh, I changed the rear shocks. It's much better. Like, much better how? What, is it a different spring rate? Do you know what your original spring rate was? Do you know what your new spring rate is? Did you even ask? Is it just the damping that was better? Or is it just a figment of your imagination? Like, you know, I'd love to see people say, oh yeah, I fit these shocks, it's much better. I'd love to see them say, well, what was your problem in the first place? What was your problem with the suspension in the first place? And identify what it was about the new shock or fork internals or whatever it was that fixed that problem. There's so many people on YouTube going, oh yeah, I swapped these shocks out for these shocks, with no idea of spring rates or why they chose that other shock. They just fell for the marketing blur. Even people putting new springs in forks. Oh yeah, I got some progressive springs from the forks. Well, you probably had them in the first place, and you went to all that trouble to buy new springs, and you just accepted the spring rate off the website, when you could have just phoned someone up, like a Wilbur's dealer, and said, this is my weight, can you recommend a spring set for my front forks? And it wouldn't cost you any extra. So if you're going to change shocks and forks, choose your spring rate, because usually it'll cost you no more. So that's what I'm saying. For me, specifically, I'm changing the springs for a higher spring rate, so I'm sitting further up in my suspension travel. I'll have excess sag due to my weight, because I'm an over average weight. In my motorbike gear, I'm 110 kilos sitting on that bike, which I know most people aren't. But if I was buying a shock, buy one with your weight in mind. And they'll ask you, when you order the shock, they'll ask you, well, do you take a pillion that often? Do you do track days? What's it for? Are you into comfort riding? You know, and it costs you no extra. As I say, I can put a YSS shock on that for 300 notes. I don't know anything about it. I don't know I don't know if I put that on, I'll have 70% sag, 10% sag, 30% sag. What's the point in doing that? So buy suspension wisely. It costs you actually nothing to buy it wisely. The Wilbur shock I'm buying, matched for my weight, cost me no more than any other weight. Whether I was 75 kilos, 120 kilos, 42 kilos. It's the same price. Just matched for me. So try and do that. If you're deciding to change your springs and your shocks or your forks, choose it intelligently rather than just saying, oh yeah, these shocks are great, you know. Or somebody on YouTube said, yeah, I fitted these and they're brilliant. Are they really? You know, unless they were sprung for your weight or your usage. Like if I was going everywhere on that thing 2 up, I would have said to the guy when I ordered the shock, give me a high spring rate. I'm going to have 200 kilos on that. And I'm going touring, and I'm always going to be 2 up. and it'd be a completely different shock for that bike, and it'd be much more suited to it. But because it's just me on that bike, no luggage, one weight, I can say, this is the weight, give me a spring matched to that weight. And they'll already have in the database the weight of the bike. So I'll get perfect springs for this. Brilliant. I'm really looking forward to it. Of course, one of the biggest benefits to changing my fork springs and getting them refurbed and changing my rear shock is the damping that I'm going to get back. So I've sorted one problem, that's a change of spring. That's great. I get my full suspension travel back, but that's no good if the damping's shite. So as I can't rebuild that shock, as I've said, it means a new shock to replace that rear one, and that's going to get my damping back as well. So that's great. The overhaul of the front forks are going to be, there's cartridge dampers in there, but I mean, it's old oil, the seals are a bit knackered, who knows what's in there. Hopefully you find no damage in there when he tears them apart, but just the very fact that I'll get new seals, a clean out, new oil, hopefully I get my full damping back at the front end too. So the damping's just as important as the spring rate. As I said, if I was a normal weight, I would probably just leave the spring rate as it was and just do the damping. So, what shocks did I look at and what led me to Wilbur's? Okay, I've had a quick look around on the web. What's my suspension choices? Well, the one that jumps out in the air at you is the YSS shock at €360. Basic shock, but it does have rebound damping, spring preload. It's very cheap, €363. It's difficult to tell whether you can get custom spring rates. I get the impression from the web it's about another €45, something like that. But it's not like some of the other manufacturers where they make it really clear on the website and you can say I want this spring rate, and or you put in your parameters and they'll give you a price there and then. So bottom dollar, you want to spend the absolute minimum. YSS, great choice. But Hagen shocks, about $350 for a shock with preload adjust, and well, they're all going to have preload adjust, but and some rebound damping. Made locally, obviously, UK, just across the water from me. I'm over here in Ireland. About €350, £300. But you know, the star buy for this though is if I was looking for a shock for a Triumph Trophy or any old touring bike, I'd really want remote preload adjuster, and you can get that on this shock from Hagen for about €500, 425 notes, and this one is just miles above all the others. I couldn't find any other shocks at this sort of price that would give you a remote preload. So for older touring bikes, I think this is a perfect shock. But I don't need remote preload adjustment. My Daytona is going to have me on it. It's going to have one weight on it, and that's it. So I can get away with just a preload collar, and I'll set that preload, and it'll never change. It'll never change. Whereas on something like a Trophy, it will, and having that remote preload adjuster is a boon. So the Hagens come out well there. Wilbur's 540, very basic shock. The thing going for it is a 5-year warranty. Bit dearer, $449, but high quality by the looks of it, £408. I still decided though, if I'm going to fit a shock, I kind of wanted one with some rebound damping at least. So another couple of popular ones. Hyper Pro, I can get the spring matched to my weight, rebound damping, little bit dear, €573. I know it says Trident 750 there, but it's the same shock for the Daytona 1200. £462. Nice looking shock. Dearest I found. Now I say dearest I found, I'm still looking for a cheap shock. So, you know, I'm not searching for Olin shocks or anything like this, just Bogo shocks. The Nitron, this is their entry level range shock, €632 or £462. They do a remote adjuster for it, remote preload adjuster, but it's an extra €304 or 222 quid. But it's great. On the website, when you're ordering this stuff, it's brilliant. Put in your rider weight. I'm using it for road. Do you ever use a pillion? What's the pillion weight? All that sort of stuff. I love this. They make it so easy. And that's a nice part about the Nitron shock. They make it so easy to just choose the exact shock you want set up just for you. So that's nice. But that's the dearest I've looked at here. What else am I looking at? Well, this is the one I plumped for in the end, a Wilbur's 640. Adjustable preload, as I say, they all will. Rebound damping. If you really want to muck about, they do all sorts of lift and lowering kits, height adjustment kits for them. Some different spring rates. They do a Nightline version of this, which is completely blacked out, which looks awesome. I think it's another 50 or 60 euros though. I ended up with this shock. Well, I say I ended up ordering this shock, 579 euros, so a little bit at the top end of my range. Mainly because I found a Wilbur's dealer in Cork, which isn't too far. It's only a couple of hours drive from where I am. And speaking to the guy, he knew exactly what I was talking about. I took us 5 or 10 minutes to go through what I was using the bike for, my weight, all this sort of stuff. And he'll spec the spring rate for me. So I sprung for these in the end, 579 euro. But I think the bargain of them all is the Hagen with or without the remote preload. And by the time I had a customized spring, it's not really quite clear from the Hagen website whether they charge you extra for a different spring rate. I don't think so, but yeah, I don't exactly know. But they make it very clear. Look, give us a bell, we'll tell you. Look, what's it say here? They give you a spring rate and they're expecting the rider to be 75 to 100 kilos. So that's kind of at the top end of the range of the average weight guy. So if you're in that weight range, their standard shock here is going to be perfect for you. So we could do this for 350 euro. But in the end, I'm going to do it for 579 euro. So there's a lot of choice out there. So I've treated myself a little bit. I've probably spent, 200 euros more than I needed. But the fact that I found a guy who was the Wilbur's importer into Ireland, who will also do me the matching Wilbur springs, and he'll overhaul the forks for me at the same time, it just made sense to put it all into one package and give the one guy the whole job. Now I'll fit the stuff myself. I've taken the forks off myself. I'll take the rear shock off myself and all that sort of stuff. But I'll let him work out the air gap and the fork oil weight and everything like that for my front forks. I know there's lots of other shockers always out there, dearer, cheaper, whatever. Well, maybe not that many cheaper ones actually. I think YSS really, if you're really, really brassic and you're an average weight, where you just pick the YSS at £269 and be done with it. Of course, getting a new shock is going to be like, it's like changing your tyres, isn't it? When you're replacing anything that's old and worn, any new shock is going to feel golden. So if I'd put that to YSS shotgun, it would have been great. But if I'd put any of these shocks on, it would have been great compared to what you're taking off. Jeez, these mirrors are bloody awful on this bike. Really bad.